It was increasingly clear as the negotiations wore on that differences wouldn't be bridged in time for Sunday's deadline. Tehran says it needs to expand enrichment to make reactor fuel for a nuclear power plant and insists the program is peaceful. But the United States and Israel suspect Iran of hiding a secret weapons program. Joining us now is Mann Leverett. She's a former US diplomat with more than 25 years in foreign policy experience and one of the few US diplomats to have actually negotiated directly with the Iranians. She has served in US embassies in the Middle East and advised two presidents, and also written a book, Going to Tehran, Why America Must Accept the Islamic Republic. Thanks so much for joining us. The first question has to be, is the glass half full or half empty? Are we going to see a deal with this 4-month extension?
Well, I would like to be optimistic, but there are real fundamental divides. There has been progress on some significant issues, but this fundamental issue about enrichment is critically important. It gets to not the number of centrifuges. You will not see the United States say Iran can only have this number of centrifuges for it to be entirely peaceful. This goes over the line to some sort of military program. That doesn't exist. The issue is really a question of independence. Iran is fiercely devoted to its independence. That's what the Islamic Revolution was all about, was Iran to be independent of foreign powers, and it wants this civilian nuclear program as part of its program for independence. So it needs to not dismantle any of its current infrastructure, which includes about 10,000 operating centrifuges, and to increase it, to have a full-fledged civilian nuclear power program. The United States wants just the opposite. The United States has finally come around after more than 10 years of pounding its fist on the table to admitting that maybe Iran could have a symbolic program, but that Iran needs to remain dependent on other countries. Now, this is kind of a funny one, because in this case, they can't really be dependent on the United States because we don't make fuel for export, nuclear fuel for export. We're actually saying Iran would have to be dependent on Russia, because Russia is the current supplier of fuel to Iran. Well, not only does this go against the very principles of the revolution in Iran and for independence, but in fact, Iran tried that. They bought fuel from Argentina until the United States got angry and forced Argentina to cut it off. And they were part of a project called Eurodiff, where actually Iran bought 10% of that project, and then they were cut off. So that's the fundamental divide, whether to keep Iran dependent on the international community or to allow them to be independent. That is going to be a very difficult bridge to cross. There may be some way to package this in a PR way and sell it, but it's going to be difficult. It's not a matter of time, it's a matter of mentality.
So what you're saying is it comes down to a question of sovereignty, and under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran does have a right to produce nuclear fuel for peaceful purposes, and they're sticking by this. But others would counter that they've been caught cheating secret programs in the past. There are UN resolutions saying stop uranium. How do we get over this impasse? What could a compromise look like? And how could they sell it to their constituencies in Iran, in the US, and of course, the other world powers as well?
Well, this is one of the reasons why there is even a negotiation, because whether or not Iran was caught cheating, and I think the IAEA does not document that, so that's a question I think the Iranians would push back on forcefully.
But the Americans, the Israelis all say they have.
Well, the Americans and the Israelis, which the Americans tend to equate with the entire international community. But this is critically important why the negotiations are going on, because the world has changed in the past 10 years. 10 years ago, when the United States would say the US, Israel, France, and Britain were the international community, nobody really made that much noise. Today, they do. So today, the United States has to take the views of particularly Russia and China very squarely into account. They have to be at the table, and they have to buy into what the political and security order is going to look like in the Middle East, not just how many centrifuges Iran is going to have. That's why we have the negotiation.
So what are we looking at in terms of a deal? A 10-year freeze, as the Americans have talked about? I know that the Iranian Foreign Minister has mentioned the word 7, but then we have the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, coming out and saying, actually, we need 10 times as many centrifuges for a peaceful nuclear program. So that this deal looks very, very tenuous at best.
Very hard to get, and you point to you tap into two critically but separate issues. One is the duration of the deal. Again, this has nothing to do with proliferation. The United States wants at least 10. Actually, they're gunning really for a 20-year deal. That has nothing to do with proliferation. That has to do with they want to outwait the Supreme Leader's life until he's dead, until the Islamic Republic actually has, in their view, a prospect of collapsing into a more pro-American political order. The Iranians are not buying into that, and that's why they're focused more on what their practical needs are. Their practical needs are based on when they have contracts or prospective contracts for nuclear plants, when they need the fuel and how much fuel they need. That gets into the number of centrifuges. And again, this is where the Supreme Leader has spoken about numbers that are much greater than the Americans are willing to consider at this point. But he's focused on what are the practical needs. The practical needs, as told him by the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Agency, who, guess what, has his PhD from MIT here in the United States, and he knows what he's doing. So they're really talking about a practical needs-based approach based on a sovereign country pursuing a technical, practical program. The United States is focused on power and influence and maintaining a pro-American political and security order in the Middle East.
The Americans, obviously taking the lead with the EU, have talked about stopping a breakout capability. You know, once you've refined uranium to 20%, it's very easy to get to 90%, which then can be made into a bomb very quickly. Do you think they would accept a limited sort of breakout capability? You know, we've talked about Iran being 6 months to a year away from potentially making a nuclear weapon. So do you think the international community would settle for sort of keeping that in its box 6 to 12 months as it is?
The breakout issue, the so-called breakout issue, I think is also a lot of smoke and mirrors. Again,
you think it's a red herring, do you?
Absolutely. Again, it's aimed at limiting Iran's domestic, indigenous, sovereign capacity to pursue this program. Yeah. If the United States and its so-called partners were really interested in proliferation, they would accept the Iranian deal, which is to convert all, not some, but all of their 20 enriched uranium into oxide, into powder to make into fuel. All of it. You solve the proliferation issue overnight. But the United States is not interested in that. You can't take away the knowledge Iran already has to make fuel at the near 20% level or even beyond. You can't take it away. So if we were really focused on the proliferation, we would have them convert it all, but we're not. We're interested in constraining capacity to constrain Iran's power and its rising power, particularly in the Middle East, at a very volatile time for the United States.
We started off this interview seeming hopeful. This is seeming less and less hopeful the more we talk. What if there isn't a deal? The US feels a little bit like the US is boxed in because the sanctions are already being tabled in the US Congress. US President Barack Obama has said all options are on the table, which is a euphemism for military action. Would that happen? I mean, if this deal goes away, are we looking at airstrikes on nuclear facilities in Iran?
Well, it's somewhat interesting that President Obama has refrained from saying for the past year almost, specifically since January of this year, he has refrained from saying all options are on the table for two reasons. One, I think in terms of allowing the negotiations to go forward, to take the military option off the table as an offensive rhetorical device used against the Iranians. But part of this is real, and this is something that from all of my trips to Tehran, I understood. The Supreme Leader there and Iranian security and political analysts there realized a few years ago that after America's failed interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, then Libya and Syria, we don't have the military option on the table, and that gives room for negotiation. So even though I'm not optimistic that there's going to be a deal, a comprehensive deal, either today or in 4 months, the new deadline, I do think that there is enough incentive on both sides to continue negotiations for a very long time. And you may see in September, when the United Nations convenes in New York, you may see not only continued intensive negotiations of high-level officials, but potentially even President Obama and President Rouhani meeting, not to actually seal the deal, but to inject enough momentum to keep it going past the congressional elections and continue to kick this can down the road.
You say kick the can down the road, but the Israelis have hinted they would not wait. We can see Israel moving very quickly into Gaza. Let's just say they would do the same with Iran, and that would be a big problem for the United States and, of course, the international community.
And what we see, Hamas testing with the Israelis, even though, a tragically high number of Palestinians have been killed in this current conflict, there's a bit of exposure of the emperor wearing no clothes, and that the Israelis are not able to defeat Hamas in Gaza, and the Iranians certainly see the Israelis having no clothes, and the Israelis are not capable. They don't have the technical capability to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, and with that, they again have more time for negotiation.
Let's take the plus side now. What if there is a deal? You wrote in your book, Going to Tehran, that there could be a Nixon-China moment. If there is a deal, do you think US President Barack Obama could be in Tehran with Rouhani talking about not just this, but other rapprochement?
I think not only could he, I think it's absolutely imperative. Though I'm pessimistic that the politics here in Washington would allow it, a real statesman would see it absolutely necessary, as President Nixon and then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger did, to go to Iran, not only to fundamentally change the relationship between the United States and Iran, but to change America's strategy from one of dominance and hegemony in the Middle East to one that is a balance of power, that recognizes and deals with all the critical powers as they are, not as we would like to transform the Middle East. That's the key thing that would enable us to change our policy. Just as when Nixon went to China, it transformed the U.S.-China relationship, but it transformed Asia and allowed Asia to rise economically and politically as it had never done before. That's the promise and the imperative of such a strategy.
You see that with all the differences between Iran and the U.S., Syria, Iraq, the Middle East, they're on opposite sides for everything.
And it's hard to imagine, though U.S.-Chinese relations today are more tense, but in the 60s, they were even worse than they are between Iran and the United States. The United States wouldn't allow Chinese athletes to compete in the Olympics. We wouldn't allow them to have their seat in the UN. The relationship was even more difficult between the U.S. and China. Nixon and Kissinger did it. They transformed Asia. They restored American power after the deadly quagmire of Vietnam. President Obama could do this. It's hard, really hard, but he can, and I think he must. That's why I wrote this book.
Thank you so much. Hilary Mann Leverett there. Next, bridging the gap between Iran and the six world powers. What concessions must be made for the international community to sign off on Iran's nuclear program? Stay with us on The Heat.